Good morning, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami. We're continuing our morning conversations. We're talking now about our line of masters, the line of masters of this particular path of self-realization. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence. Help us to feel your wisdom, your loving guidance, your clarity, your faith in us, that everything we do, whether wise or misguided, will still lead us step by step to our perfect home in the perfect realization of our oneness with thee. Om. Peace. Amen. When in 1986, I traveled to India for the first time. I didn't really travel very much in my life until my early 30s, mid-30s. My adventure, I came to Ananda at a very young age, and some of my friends who came at a similar age to mine had adventured around the world prior to getting there, but I never went anywhere, never did anything really. And so in 1986, by the time I went to India, I'd been to Europe, but still was not much of a traveler. But I had always thought I'd go to India for the first time with Swamiji, but as it turned out, the idea of leading spiritual pilgrimages sponsored by Ananda had become a popular idea, starting with Swamiji leading trips to the Holy Land, to Israel. And so 4 of us decided to be the leaders to take a group to India. So I was leading a trip to India when I'd never been to India before. Of the 4 of us, only one of us had ever been. But I was very knowledgeable about our path and about many of the places that we were going to visit. So my contribution was not on the logistics, but it was just in terms of where we were and what we were doing. Lahiri Mahashaya's house is in Varanasi, the family home, the Lahiri home. Lahiri is his family name. Mahashaya means great soul. His name was Sham Lahiri, but he was always known as Lahiri, the great soul Mahashaya. And even though the house is still in the hands of the family, in 1986, the family was in residence. Since that time, the family has kept the house, but no one lives there full time. But because people live there full time, there was his Banamali Lahiri. He was probably a great-grandson or even a great-great-grandson of Lahiri, and he owned the house and lived in it, and he welcomed visitors. So we went to the city of Varanasi, and I'm going to say this because every time I think of Lahiri, I think of that location because that's where his vibration was really given to us. So I thought you might sort of enjoy having a picture of it. I say this because it's very difficult to get into that house now. Whenever Banamali died, which was 15 years ago or something like that, then the house is no longer open. There's a pujari who goes in to do the necessary ceremonies for the temples that are there, the deities that are still installed there. And somebody goes in to clean the house. This is so I've been told. Once a year, I believe the house is open, but the rest of the time you can only go up to the door and you can't get inside. So part of what being in that house and what I want to describe is to help you sort of feel where the particular lila, the divine play of Lahiri Mahashaya took place. Varanasi is considered to be the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. India has the unique distinction of being the only continuous culture still in existence in the world. There have been great civilizations in Babylon and Judea and Egypt and, Peru, but all of them had a certain uh, experience of this great culture. They left monuments that tell us what was there, but then there was some enormous break, and whatever human life and culture inhabits that space now, it's not continuous. Whereas India has been one continuous culture for as far back as people know. They go back thousands of years and they find evidence of the same mantras, the same yoga postures, the same deities. So it's very, very unusual. Among the many reasons why India is considered the guru of the planet, this is one of them. In Varanasi, Benares, it's had two different names, right on the Ganges, has always been considered to be one of the holiest places in India, therefore one of the holiest places on the planet. And it's been this continuous culture of ancient, in a way that those of us who live in the USA or other, well, especially a country like ours, which is barely, 200 years old. I mean, 200 compared to thousands, you just can't even begin to think about it. So when I went to Varanasi for the first time, it was my first trip to India, and there's so many aspects of India that are just impossible to describe, especially then. India has enormously modernized and become tremendously Western, but when we went in 1986, they were still following the Gandhian principle of making India its own self-contained world, and it was closed to foreign corporations. Everything that happened within the boundaries of India, and they were not an international. They didn't participate in the same way in the international world. A few years later, Pepsi-Cola came into India and did a big launch from the Taj Mahal. And that was sort of the beginning of what is necessary. As Swamiji said, India is much too important to the destiny of the world to remain an isolated backwater. And it's, the great positive fact of the English domination of India is that English is really the national language of India. And inasmuch as English is becoming the global language, Indians have been able to step into the international scene more easily than many other cultures. Of course, there's other languages spoken, and officially it's Hindi, but the fact is English is the unifying language. So going into Varanasi, which is right on the Ganges, um, it's quite possible today that I'll have to also talk about Lahiri tomorrow, because I really want to sort of give you an idea of where he was. The Ganges goes right. Varanasi is built right on the edge of the Ganges, and there are all these what they call ghats. Ghats are these long stairways that just lead from the bank down into the water. Depending how high the river is, it depends how many steps there are. There can be just a certain point and many, many steps underwater. And then when the tide is out, when the river recedes, there's many more steps going down. Dasa Samit Ghat is one of the most famous ghats in the context of Autobiography of a Yogi, because it is said that Mataji, Babaji's sister, lives under a stone in an underground cave there. And the incredible scene, which I talked about yesterday, where Mataji comes out from under her cave and meets Babaji, and they talk about whether he's going to keep his body. It happened right there on this particular ghat. And you can walk down and look at the stones and try to figure out which one Mataji is living under at this time. So there is a feeling about that city. It was especially my first journey there, my first trip to India, just to really set the scene for I'm reminiscing a little here. We were in Varanasi on the full moon. And it became, when we started organizing our trips over the next 20 years, we would always try to start with Varanasi on the full moon and then set everything around that. At that time, security was much more lax, and you were allowed to be on the river. You could be on boats in the middle of the night. They don't always let you do that anymore. But it was a full moon in Varanasi, and it was a full eclipse of a full moon, which was spiritually just an extraordinarily focused and amazing time. And so when it was our first day in Varanasi, and we came down those ghats, there were 30 of us from America. None of us, except one, had ever been in India before. There are thousands of people lining the bank of the river because we're a foreign group. We come down, we get into our boats, not motorboats, but boats rowed by men that we'd hired to do that. They move us out into the middle of the river, and then we just rested there, just stayed in place. The boatman kept the boat from following the current. And then we watched the bank where there were all these thousands of people and watched the moon eclipse. And when the moon was fully eclipsed, it was the auspicious moment for everyone to come into the river. So we watched all these thousands of pilgrims, come to dip into the Ganges at the same moment that the moon was eclipsing. And it was the deepest realization of how arbitrary all my values were, about how arbitrary my sense of what was supposed to happen was, who I was supposed to be, what life was supposed to be like. Of course, if I had been more cosmopolitan, more global before that point, it might not have been such a stark contrast. God knows I'd already been with Swami by that point, for 15 years. And he had certainly broadened my horizons, and I had by that point traveled with him extensively through Europe. But still, the realization of how very little I knew even about my own spiritual path. Because here we were in this city which had served such a profound and played such a profound and important role in the whole dissemination of Master's path, because it was Lahiri's home, and his whole incarnation of establishing Kriya Yoga happened right there in that place. And the whole atmosphere of it was just so different. My part of what happened to me on that first trip, which is a very important thing to realize, everything is so different now. I suffer from old lady syndrome in certain ways. And so certain realities that are very vivid and were very important in the forming of my understanding are just not the realities that other people are living with. So I have to just say what I have to say, and you'll have to think it through yourself. I had come to Ananda, and we were this very, very isolated ashram. Ananda village at that point. We didn't have to say Ananda village then because there was only one Ananda. We ran a retreat, and many people came to that retreat, but they came to us. We would go out and Swami would teach around California and in various places, but there was very much and this is even how Swami described it. For the first 10 years, we just defined ourselves and let people come into our world. And Swamiji was closer to his years in India, and because he had left in 1962, and so I came, he came to that land there in 68, so he was really close to it. He dressed most of the time in Indian clothes, especially in the summer. He just wore a dhoti. He would go bare-chested with a Rudrakshamala and this orange dhoti. He had his hair long. He sang, we did many, many Indian chants. He would sing these beautiful Indian bhajans, beautiful Indian songs, devotional songs. We had Indian names. We dressed in Indian clothes. It was sort of I don't want to quite use the word fantasy because it was also exceedingly deep and real. But it was just our idea, our idea of what India would be like. And, there was no overcrowding. There was no real reality to it. I think it was more like a memory. It was a memory of some idyllic village life with our guru. And we literally walked these dusty paths, and often barefoot through the summer, just walking these dusty paths in the summer. And I really often really didn't know where I was. I mean, I wasn't located in time and space. I was entirely in the now of having found my spiritual home, found my spiritual teacher, found my spiritual family. It's like everything else in the world was really just like a thin shadow compared to that um, extraordinary experience. So I thought we were Indian. And when I got to India, I realized that, I mean, I thought the teachings that Master had brought us were the teachings of India. And it wasn't until I got to India and went to a few temples and just began, by the time we got to Varanasi, I was into it, well steeped in it. I realized that what Master brought was about as Hindu as it was Catholic. That's how I felt. You could see remnants of what we were doing, you could see shadows of it in what was modern day Hinduism, and you could see shadows of what we were doing in what was modern day Catholicism. But we were no more Catholic than we were Hindu, and no more Hindu than we were Catholic, which is to say we were neither at all. And I really began to understand what Master meant when he said, when Swami asked him, "Is this a new religion?" And Master said, "No, it's a new expression." I think yesterday I actually said that Master taught from Judaism and Christianity, but of course what I meant was Hinduism and Christianity, from the Gita and from the Bible, primarily the New Testament, Jesus and Krishna. That's what he came to unite, but in a completely new expression. And yet, and Swamiji, Master himself, he died after reciting a poem of heartfelt love and longing for my India. My body, I am hallowed, he said. My body touched that sod. Where men, he talked about it, where Ganges and woods and so on, where men dream God. He talked about India as an eternal reality, as a place where men dream God. That's the nature of that country. And then Master said, I am hallowed. My body touched that sod. So here we have our God realized Master, Master himself, who stands completely outside time and space and culture and national identity. And yet he had this reverence for this place. And yet when you arrive in India, now especially back in 1986, you just encounter realities that are so different. I mean, in school, I've studied the concept overpopulation, but it wasn't until I was in Varanasi and then especially later in Calcutta that the word overpopulation really begins to mean something, because there are just, what do you know, so many people in such a small space, and all the competition for resources and everything that that does. It fights against your idyllic image of, well, of Ananda village in the 70s, where you're in this beautiful rural setting with absolute simplicity, and there with your teacher under, literally under the trees, hearing about these divine truths. And yet, I'm a very, especially at that time, I considered it a virtue to be very sensitive. I have since realized that it's a terrible weakness, and so instead of celebrating it, I fight against it. But at that time, I was very sensitive. Noise would bother me, crowds would bother me, just everything would bother me. We were in Varanasi. We were in open rickshaws. Probably, yeah, they would have been bicycle rickshaws. I don't think they were, yeah, they were bicycle rickshaws. We were trying to get to the river because we were staying a little too far out of town. Later, we started staying closer in. We got into a traffic jam that was absolute gridlock, and we just couldn't get out of it. So we literally stepped over all our rickshaws and just got ourselves out onto the sidewalk, and then just wended our way on foot because we could make faster time than staying in that. And it was noisy and polluted, and people shouting and horns, and I was absolutely blissful, just absolutely blissful, because it it was coming up from the soil. I just completely understood that I'd never been to Israel at that point, But the phrase holy land, not applying to Israel, but holy land. This land is sanctified because for time beyond count, great saints and sages have walked this way. So there we are in the middle of the river at midnight, just watching these thousands of people, doing something that was completely unheard of in the world that all of us had come from. To be on the river, to even know that it was a full moon, to know that it was eclipsing, to come down, to walk into the river with your clothes on, which is how people did it mostly, just immerse in the Ganges and then say the mantras and do the ritual of generally ducking your head 3 times, splashing water over your head, saying the mantras, just absolutely transfixed and taken somewhere else. And this we weren't quite within sight of Lahiri Mahashaya's house, but this was the ground on which Lahiri had lived. This was the atmosphere in which Lahiri taught Kriya Yoga. This was the point of entry after Babaji had called Lahiri to the mountains and reawakened in him his awareness of why he was born and what his destiny was. This is the place where he was. Varanasi also is the city where Sri Yukteswar's mother lived, and it was the city where Master was when he met his guru, all in this same place. And the Dasa Samad Ghat is recognizable because it has all these umbrellas, but then presumably now. So it looks different than the other ghats because of these many umbrellas. I don't know what the details are. So we could also, and we were right near the Dasa Samad Ghat because we knew that was where Mataji had her cave. And so we just sat there and watched it for a long time. And when the whole ritual was over and the energy was beginning to dissipate, we came back to the ghat where our boats had docked, and we started up the stairs. And just so that the evening would be as if there wasn't enough to change our complete perspective on reality. As we're walking up the stairs, this small group with no women, just men, a few men come walking down the stairs. They're all dressed in white. Now they've missed the moment of immersion, but they're coming down to get into a boat. And I looked over and I realized the man is carrying a small child, except the child is not visible because the child is wrapped in a winding sheet because the child has died. So I'm told by our guide that this is the father of a child who has died. And it is the tradition that if a child is less than 5 and leaves his body, that they don't cremate the body, they just give it to the Ganges. So this father and some of his male relatives were just coming down the ghat to get in the boat, and the baby was wrapped, and he was going to go into the middle of the river and weight the body and drop the body into the Ganges. Now, we hadn't even visited yet the cremation grounds, which the cremation grounds are also right on the river there. But we knew they were there. We had seen them, but we hadn't actually settled ourselves and observed. The cremation grounds, it's right on the river. It's perfectly public. People walking up and down the river will walk by it. It's just a sandy bank where great pyres are made of wood. The relatives come with the corpse on a little cot that they carry on their shoulders. You see them walking through the street, person covered in flowers, covered in white. They'll just carry it down to the ghat. They'll put the body right there. They'll light the fire, and then the family will stand around until the body is consumed. The ashes are gathered and thrown into the Ganges. It's just all right there. And as I remember this man walking down and us walking up like this. And I thought to myself, what a different world. The world I live in, everything is so sanitized. I had, someone dies I guess this was long before, but I had the occasion many years later when a friend of mine died at home, and not at Ananda, so the situation was slightly different. She was an Ananda devotee, but she lived with her family. But after she died, the husband called the mortuary, and these two obsequious young men come and they put her body into a body bag and put it on a gurney and just carry it off like that. And her husband and I just watched them. He said to me, "Now there's a job I wouldn't want to have." But I just watched them carry it away. But we'd have no idea whatever happened. Then some little glass urn comes back. In India, body's on your shoulder. You take your mother and you lay her on the sticks. And this man carries his own baby and puts the child into the river. And it's just like your heart just rips open. You just don't have the capacity to hide, as we do in the sanitized world that we live in. Now, of course, there's many, 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 many positive things that can be said about the advance of modern civilization. I'm by no means, a person who wants to reject it all. But just accepting and being involved in the process of death totally shifts your relationship to life, because all around you, you recognize that this is an interlude. This is not something that will always be like this. And how we spend our time and what we do with our lives and what is important to us and how we relate to each other. It's, at least to my mind, I've never been the same since I was in Varanasi. I've never been the same since I saw that man carrying his own dead child down the steps to put it in the river. It's such a courage is the word that comes to mind, but it's courage based on the fact that there is no choice. It's courage that this is what God asks of us. We incarnate, we live for a time, but the entire context of our lives is not all this stuff that we're doing. And again, the point of my saying all this is this is the context in which Kriya was launched. Eventually, Master came to America and set up headquarters in Los Angeles. But that's not where it started. We started with Babaji up in the Himalayas, and as it is said, what Babaji did is he brought back into the world a very, very ancient technique that had been lost sight of as we went through the Dark Ages. Because in the Dark Ages, it simply, meaning Kali Yuga, it just wasn't possible for mankind as a whole to have access to this. But as Dwapara was beginning to sort of open itself and show us a new possibility, it was necessary for this great technique to also come out of the Himalayas. But it had to start someplace where the soil was ripe. And it wasn't just Lahiri himself, but it was the entire context, in a place where they hadn't forgotten. The Kali Yuga time had diminished India tremendously and made it impoverished and created all these terrible material world difficulties, which were in fact enormous, but it hadn't touched the reality of it. And that's, in the terrible traffic jam and all of that, it's like India itself just sort of had been there so much longer. And the presence of God in that soil had been there so much longer that it could sort of wear this confusion for a period of time, because the power of it was truly untouched. So tomorrow, my friends, I'll talk more about Lahiri himself and visiting his home and what he has to offer us. But I wanted to share with you that experience of mine of touching in to the holy city where Lahiri had his Leela. God bless you.